Salam. So I'm Najiba. I am a social worker, life coach, and Enneagram teacher. I live in Wayland, Massachusetts with my three kids. I'm also a chaplain, so I serve currently as a chaplain at Center DC. So I'm a community chaplain and I do virtual chaplaincy.
So, what drew you to the Enneagram and how did you first get into it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think what drew me to the Enneagram was a question that I had, which was, why am I like this? And I specifically remember asking a friend of mine this question as I was struggling with a particular relationship in my life. And something about the relationship was kind of um, giving me a lot of stress and anxiety. And I remember asking her, like, why is this bothering me so much? Yeah, I was kind of asking her to help me figure out why certain things made me upset or what was it about how I was interacting with this person that was causing me a lot of distress. And she introduced me to the Enneagram and said, have you ever looked at this Enneagram system? And I said, no. And she showed it to me, just pulled out her laptop and we looked at some stuff online. And that was the beginning of my journey, just really wondering about myself and wondering why certain struggles kept reappearing in my life.
So, can you tell us what is the Enneagram exactly and where did it originate?
Sure. So the Enneagram is basically a symbol. It has 9 points. It looks kind of like a star in a circle. And the origins are a bit mysterious, so I've tried to look into them myself as well. Many people trace it back to oral traditions coming from different spiritual communities, and specifically Sufism is often named. And so that's really what piqued my interest when I was looking at the Enneagram. So you'll find the types or the points on the circle represent different I would say kind of stuck places. Some people call them vices. Some people call them, in literature like Chaucer or Dante, you might have like the seven deadly sins or things that kind of draw us away from God or draw us away from ourselves. And so you find these points on the circle making their way into many different spiritual and mystical traditions. How it came into the West was through a thinker named Gurdjieff, and he brought it into the Western context, and it was passed through someone named Oscar Ichazo, Claudio Naranjo. So there are different thinkers and teachers who started teaching it more in a Western context. And then at some point, it kind of went public. It used to be something that was taught in kind of private spiritual circles as an oral tradition. And it wasn't initially something that was like written down. It was never taught as a typology. It was really taught more as a way to like look peer into yourself and use it as kind of a path forward, like a path of spiritual growth. So those are some of the origins of it, but listeners can definitely look into the history of it more to find out more.
hmm Just hold on a second. I just want to pull up a diagram here so people can. Okay, so here we go. Can you see this Enneagram? So here we have the diagram with the 9 points. So interesting because you mentioned that these are more vices, and I always thought of them to be personality types. So they're vices, not personality types, because isn't there also good in them?
Yeah, so that each point on the circle is supposed to represent a kind of a stuck place, and that stuck place actually gives birth to a personality type. And so again, in the earlier teachings, it was not taught as a typology, but rather kind of these are different points that represent some people call them like ego fixations. So the idea is each type is built upon a kind of false idea because the idea of the personality is it's trying to create some kind of like image, some sort of mask to address, what's going on at that point. So I think of them as pain points in a way. Like finding your type means identifying with the pain or the suffering of the story associated with that type. So that's kind of it's kind of both end. Each point on the circle represents a quote unquote personality, but what it's really rooted in is the kind of unique suffering of that point on the map.
What you're saying reminds me of the hadith that من عرف نفسه فقد عرف ربه. So whoever knows himself knows his Lord. And this is where I see the value of the Enneagram lies. And this is exactly why I'm having you here today, because all of us are on a journey. All of us make mistakes. And I find that there's so much of wisdom in Enneagram. I know that a friend of mine, she used to tell me, you should really look into the Enneagram. And I used to kind of dismiss it, thinking, oh, whatever, one of these dumb personality tests again, and these questionnaires you have to do. And I thought, okay, it's just another Myers-Briggs thing. And then when I looked into it and I read my type, I was blown away. I was absolutely blown away. And I actually got this book that you suggested I get, which was The Wisdom of the Enneagram. And I'd highly recommend it to people who are interested in learning more about their type. And I just wanted to quickly read a quote here from the conclusion that what we must learn is to stop running away from ourselves. When we see ourselves as we really are, our truth and our falseness, we begin a process of unlearning the habit of abandoning ourselves and of living in illusions, reactions, and defenses. Any comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great quote. I do love that book, and they also have another really good one for those, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's the Personality Types textbook by Riso and Hudson, which takes you through all the levels of each type, from the highest of the high to the lowest of the low. And that reading that also reminded me of the ayah in the Quran that talks about how Allah has created us as human souls, and you know we can reach the highest of the high, but we can also reach the lowest of the low. And that text literally shows you at each level um, how you're interacting with yourself and the universe and those around you. Um, and I like what you said about becoming more free from some of the illusions. And I think that's really the gift that the Enneagram brings, is it shows us some of the illusions that we are creating in our own lives. And in many cases, we're creating self-fulfilling prophecies. So we're taking a particular belief or standpoint or using a certain lens and analyzing and judging the world based on that, and then drawing conclusions from that. So it's kind of like a closed loop. And so for me, the Enneagram is a way to show us kind of a way out of that closed loop of behavior, thought, feeling, and allow us to open up. And that's really what the circle represents, and that's what the lines represent, is actually our movement. And so many people say the Enneagram is basically a map. It's not telling us what to do and how to do it, but it's showing us a map of our movement as human beings. And what that means is if you find yourself on the map and you find the point that represents your current state of being, you can use the lines as ways to challenge yourself, push yourself, see where your growth path lies. And it acknowledges that each of us actually has a very, very unique growth path. And that was something that was never clear to me until I understood my type and the Enneagram, and it really drove home like that each of us is on a unique journey. And so our journeys are not going to look the same. And, no matter how much we develop ourselves, we're not all going to turn into one kind of person. We actually have unique gifts, unique capabilities. And I loved that the Enneagram was showing like both the darkness and the light. So I'm trained as a social worker, and I was trained to diagnose people. When you meet with a client, you diagnose them, and then you have to write, in your little notebook for insurance, what the diagnosis is. And it was very much kind of I wouldn't call it like a strengths-based approach. It was like, let's find out what's wrong with you. And so when I found the Enneagram, I found it to be a breath of fresh air, because it's not about let's find out what's wrong with you. It's, let's find out what your true nature is and how you can live into that, and let go of some of the things that are holding you back.
So I suppose that if one would want to discover what their type is, they could either take an online free test, or you could actually meet with an Enneagram coach who could, what's the word, assess and determine that, right?
Yes, exactly. So I got lucky with the online test. I took it, it gave me my correct type. But then, I actually put it away for quite a while and didn't think about it at all. I was like, oh, that's nice, like, ho
Hmm.
hum kind of thing. But then for some reason, it came back to me and I can't remember why. And then I started reading. And then once I read one book, I was like, I couldn't stop. So I just kept reading more and more. So I would recommend the online tests are very hit or miss because they're asking you to analyze yourself. And some of us are pretty crafty, so we can answer the questions in a way that maybe we'd like to think about ourselves, but it may not be the most honest answer that we're able to give. So the online tests can be helpful. So I've actually been trained to do Enneagram typing as an interview format, and I found that to be one of the best ways because it's actually a conversation that you're having with someone, and you ask them questions, and you don't just listen to what they're saying, but you kind of listen to like the energy behind the words or like, the vibe or the tone behind the words. So that's been a really helpful process that I've seen is like doing a live interview, so that someone can kind of walk you through the different types and just kind of hone in on a couple of types that are in your neighborhood. And from there, it really is, what they say is like an inside job. Like no one else can tell you what your type is because at the end of the day, you might have behaviors that are very similar to another person, but it's actually the motivations behind the behavior that determine your type. And really, nobody else can know what your internal motivation is other than yourself. So I would say any one of those things, trying a typing test, getting a really good Enneagram book that ex goes through the type, so not relying on like memes or Instagram or like short posts, but really d diving deep into a study of the types, or doing an interview.
Okay. Could you go through these different types and mention what makes each one unique?
Sure. Um, okay, so I'll start with type one. Um, and each of these types, I would think of them as an archetype. So it's like an archetype of a type of person. So we might recognize ourselves in many of these archetypes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's our core type. It just might mean that a part of that archetype lives in us. And I think all of us do have the capacity to kind of live into all of them to a certain extent. Okay, so I'll start with type one. So the names that are on the screen here are names that were given by, this particular organization. I think this is Truity, but they're not standard across different books. So the type numbers are always the same, but the actual title given is just based on, the author or the thinker who was doing that. So I'll talk about type ones first. So here they're called the perfectionists, and they're basically people who really want to get it right. They want to find purpose in their lives. They want to make themselves better, make other people around them better. They want to find solutions that can be applied in the real world. They're very ethical. They tend to have a clear life mission outlined in their mind. And they're also very hardworking to actually transform that vision into a reality. They have a strong sense of duty. They can be quiet or controlled in how they speak, but they can also be outgoing. And they're people who really follow through on their words and commitments. They tend to struggle with sometimes judgment and anger because being perfectionists, they may want themselves or others to live up to certain standards that can sometimes be hard to maintain. Next, we have
Okay,
type.
I've got a question though, because I can see that if you're looking at number one, there's a line that is connecting to the four and to the seven. What does that mean?
So this is where the Enneagram gets really good, right? So it's not just about finding your point on the circle. It's finding your relationship between the other points and what the significance of that is. So each of these lines represents like a movement pattern that relates specifically to um, your point on the map. And it's almost like, I went to a personal trainer recently and I was telling her I have lower back pain and I've been going to the gym, but it hasn't been helping. And she's like, yeah, that's because you can go to the gym and do any random exercises, right? There's millions of exercises you can do, but they're not going to help you unless you are doing the exercises that are right for your body and for the problem that you're having. And, I listened to her and I worked with her, and she gave me very, very specific exercises to do to address my issue. And, lo and behold, it helped. It helped more than some of the other things that I was doing where I was just kind of like, oh, like I want to be healthy, right? So I'm gonna lift weights and run and do all these things. But I wasn't quite honing in on some of the specific issues that my body was having. So similarly, you can do self-development work, right? And for myself as a Muslim, I was always interested in the concept of self-development through Islam, specifically like understanding the diseases of the heart, looking at like Hamza Yusuf's work, and looking at many different kind of uh, programs or ways of looking at, how to be a better person within the context of Islam. What was really mind blowing to me about the Enneagram was it was all of a sudden showing a mirror like, yes, everyone needs to work on these characteristics, but you specifically need to really work on this, right? So going back to the diagram, as a type one, that seriousness, that kind of perfectionism, it needs something from points 7 and 4 to balance out the imbalance in that particular lens. And so as you begin to work on your type, the first step is really just, first of all, just acceptance that like, okay, I really am this way, or I really am showing up in the world a certain way. These are my blind spots. I would say that's like the first step. And then there's observing yourself, seeing where the patterns show up. And then eventually you get to a stage where you're trying to push against. So you're trying to not necessarily fight with yourself, but you're trying to push yourself out of your comfort zone. And the lines are going to show you how to do that. Because if you look over at what's happening at point 7, you'll find things there that are maybe missing. So point 7 is a place of great enthusiasm, great joy, very positive, optimistic thinking, boundless, breaking rules, not caring about how other people do things, not caring about, black and white and right and wrong and all of this in kind of like a very puritanical way. It's kind of like letting the energy loose. And so if you think about that, like that's something that's a very balancing energy to the type one. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the second one.
Okay, so type two, often called the giver. These are very empathic, highly caring individuals who tend to put others' needs before their own. They have this intuitive ability to anticipate other people's needs and emotions, offer them support. They find great joy in being a source of encouragement, a shoulder to cry on for others, being a special friend, and they can learn how to adapt to other people's expectations. They often struggle with repressing their own feelings and desires in an effort to be supportive to other people. So they can kind of struggle with looking at themselves as opposed to living for others. So type three, these are often called the achievers. They're defined by their desire to be significant and distinguish themselves through their achievements. They can often appear very confident, very ambitious, very goal-oriented. Inside, though, they can have doubts about their own self-worth and look for validation through their accomplishments. Moving on to type four. Type fours are often called the individualists. Some also call them the artists. They're defined by a sense of being special or different from others. They're often creative and present a very unique, distinctive persona to people around them. They can experience a deep longing to connect with themselves, with others, but often feel that because they're unusual or unique, that very few others are able to truly see them as they are. Type fives are called the investigators. They're the pioneers of independent and critical thinking. They're very inquisitive and curious about the connections between underlying themes and the mysteries of the universe. They're often very introverted, analytical. They tend to gather a lot of information and try to synthesize it. They also can be nonconformist, not really caring a lot about trends or, what other people think. And they're often defined by their desire to conserve their energy to avoid being drained by engagement with the outside world. So they can be a little bit more reclusive, although there are some fives who are very social as well. Sixes are defined by their desire for safety and security. They're called the skeptic on this model. That's because they ask a lot of questions. You can just imagine someone with kind of one eyebrow raised. They tend to seek, they basically try to anticipate risk, future scenarios, what could go wrong, so they can troubleshoot. So they're very alert, very vigilant. They're always thinking a few steps ahead. Sevens, here they're called the enthusiasts, sometimes the epicure. They're defined by this desire to experience everything life has to offer. So kind of really wanting to taste life in many different ways, and also trying to avoid pain or boredom. They appear to be lively, fun-loving. They're often very busy people, who are on a quest to squeeze all the joy out of life. They can fear getting stuck, or missing out on the good things in life. And yeah, they can struggle with kind of slowing down or coming down into some of the deeper or more painful emotions. Eights are defined by their desire to be powerful. So they're often called the challenger. They present this confident, assertive image. They can sometimes be intimidating. They're very goal-oriented, very confident. They're trailblazers. They're not afraid to, stand up for themselves or others. They can be rebels. Their deep fear is being vulnerable or being powerless. So they put on a strong front to protect against that. And finally, we have nines, the peacemaker. They're defined by their desire to maintain an inner sense of peace and harmony. And in order to do that, they avoid conflict with others or emotional disturbances. So they're typically seen as very agreeable, calm, easy to be with. They rarely rock the boat, but they can be stubborn. They typically like to go with the flow. They don't want to be controlled by others, but they also don't want to push others out of their comfort zone. And yeah, their highest value is harmony.
Thank you. So, Najiba, a person might read up about their personality type and then they'll say, great, I've now had the mirror held up to me. I see all my vices in all of their glory. Or now what do I do? What do I do with this information? And so once a person identifies their type, how do they take that and then use that to benefit themselves in their personal relationships, in the work sphere, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and a lot of Enneagram coaches say, okay, what's the now what, right? After you understand your type. So I think the Enneagram is really the reason why it's often called a map is it's just showing you the places you could go. But again, it's not showing you all the steps. So, I described it as a mirror. So this idea of like, okay, I'm going to look into this mirror, and become really honest with myself. I think that's the first kind of benefit of the Enneagram is allowing us to become honest with ourselves because it's almost like taking the veil off of our eyes. And I think, perhaps traditionally when we engage in spiritual growth, maybe we have somebody who helps us do that, who helps point out to us like, where our gaps are, where we need to focus. Like, I'll always read these stories about, somebody who goes into a monastery or a place of like spiritual growth and they're made to like scrub the toilet, or if they're a very sleepy person, they're made to get up first to like ring the bell. And, the person who's directing them, the spiritual director, knows what they need to develop themselves. Maybe they're a little bit lazy, maybe they're a little bit arrogant, maybe they're, a little bit nervous. And so according to what their nature is, you might need to push them in a certain direction. So I feel like the Enneagram is a little bit of a cheat sheet for that. And some people say it's like worth like 10 years of therapy, like rather than kind of spinning your wheels trying to figure out what's plaguing you, it just gives you like this little manual, right? And again, it's an inside job. No one else from the outside can come and tell you like, this is your type and this is what you need to work on. Like you really need to see it for yourself. So I think sitting with it and just being able to come to some kind of acceptance of yourself like, wow, I really see this in myself. And just noticing without judgment for the first time. That I would say is like the first stage of growth with the Enneagram is because often when people give us feedback about ourselves, it's full of all sorts of judgment, right? Like someone's telling us about ourselves and they're blaming us for being a certain way or doing a certain thing. And that's an attack, right? It feels like an attack that comes at us. And so it's often very difficult to integrate that kind of feedback from others. But for me, what I found beautiful about the Enneagram is it was offering this kind of feedback from a fairly neutral perspective, even though it's really painful to read about the lower levels of development and, you know, the games that we play with ourselves and people. It can be like really shocking to discover that we're doing that. For example, as a nine, reading that I'm passive aggressive is like, wow, like what is that about, right? And then like going back and looking at my life and looking at, okay, what were all the times where I wanted to do or say something, but I didn't, and instead I did or said something else, or I didn't, own a feeling that I have or own an opinion that I had, but instead it leaked out in this other way. So like it kind of gives you a moment to take stock of yourself, your life, um, kind of connect the dots. Like for me, I started to look back at like my relationship, with my work colleagues or with friends or with family, and started to kind of tease out where my pattern was at play. And so for the first time, it made me feel like I was actually an actor in my own life rather than just a recipient of like, you know, things happening to me or other people doing things and me just being this neutral person. So often we see ourselves through a little bit of like a rose-colored glass of like, oh yeah, I do what I do because, it makes sense to me. I feel like I'm a reasonable person. I try to do the right thing. I try to be good. But it kind of shows you there's another element there. So I would say the first step is really owning your type, sitting with it, doing some of your own meditation on yourself, doing some journaling. Like, there's some great exercises out there. Like, notice when this thought starts to come up. And this is similar to what people do when they have a meditation practice, is they start to notice what's the pattern of the mind that keeps coming up, right? Same kind of thoughts. Or what's the pattern of the heart? Like, oh, like I'm noticing that I always have this little bit of sadness that's always kind of lingering there or noticing the body, like, why am I always restless? And then you start to connect that back to your type, right? Like, what's underneath that? So I would say the self-study is like a really big step. Using a text again that kind of shows you, like, the different stages of your type. And then eventually you get to, the stage of like trying to push against, right? So like pushing against your type, doing, some people call it making a U-turn. So like if I'm conflict averse, how do I push myself to go ahead and engage in the conflict? Go ahead and push back, rock the boat, say something that someone doesn't agree with. Don't nod your head yes when inside you're nodding your head no. Like, kind of just like recognize that there's this pattern that keeps trying to push you in a certain direction and recognize that like that's not your higher truth. That's actually coming out of a place of fear, maybe, or shame or anger. And actually all the Enneagram points have a specific emotion that they're wrestling with. And so once you realize that some of your behaviors, they're not coming from your highest self, they're coming from this ego pattern. And that's ultimately, I think, what can create a kind of shift where you feel that you can actually take back your life from this pattern that's been holding you hostage, and you didn't know that it was holding you hostage. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of an example of a path that a person can go on. But really, it's the whole world of possibilities of what you could do. Like as a body type, I started doing more body work, like trying to move my body in new ways, trying to use my voice in new ways, realizing like if I want to release, suppressed anger as a type nine, I need to speak up, I need to sing, I need to recite, I need to move my body, move my energy. So you start to learn more about what can help somebody like you. Um, and so that's a whole world of different types of activities, it could be therapies, it could be just new experiences that you engage in. It could be extracting yourself from certain situations that you're like, wow, this is really bad for a person of my temperament. Maybe I need to change my environment to an environment that's going to support me in my growth, rather than continuing to kind of engage in environments that are not leading me to my highest self.
So what I'm hearing, gathering from you is that it's almost like a type of deep mindfulness. Because in mindfulness practices, we usually focus on breath or calming the mind, but this is like a mindfulness of observing oneself, one's patterns, one's interaction, one's speech, one's thoughts, one's feelings, all of that. And then, as you said, in the second part of that observation, it's almost like it's in a way it's studying the self as if you are some kind of creature under a microscope, and then when you have seen, aha, now I see how this creature operates, then for me personally, I've seen that then when we fall into automated responses to things, then you can catch yourself and say, that is such a four. That is such a four thing. Let's see if we can just sort of sit in this moment a bit and expand and just like, stay there for a moment and see if that discomfort passes, and as you said, where you counteract your normal tendency. And so in that way, the beauty of that, I see, it's like you mentioned the word therapy, but you can become your own therapist in a way, because then you can say or observe and that this is the area that I need support. So you might of course need to reach out to other people to support you in that, but the areas that need work, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. One of the examples that was given in the coaching program that I did, or one of the metaphors was he took like a pen or a pencil and said, this is the driver of your personality, but all this time it's been back here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to bring it here in front of our eyes. So it's kind of like a subject object move. And now you're seeing this driver. Oh, it's not me who's driving the bus. It's this. Now, what is this, right? And so if we imagine this as being the personality or the ego, now we can kind of examine it, see what it's doing, deconstruct it. We all of a sudden put it in front of us. And so now that it's in front of us, we can actually have a relationship with it that's a little bit removed, because often, people often talk about this idea of like, are we our thoughts or do we observe our thoughts, right? Like every thought that goes through our mind, do we believe all of these thoughts? And sometimes if we examine them, some of them actually don't make very much sense or they're very self-deprecatory. They could be abusive thoughts like you're nothing, you're worthless, or you'll never amount to anything, or they could be all sorts of thoughts. They could be grandiose. Um, but by putting our personality type in front of us, it's showing us, well, these are the types of patterns that you can get stuck in. It could be fear-based thinking. It could be self-regulatory. It could be the opposite. But now we get to like examine it and kind of be a little bit of a scientist and be like, okay, like you said, like, so this is what's coming up here. This is the game I'm playing with myself, or this is the kind of automatic lens that's kicking into gear. And I love that quote. I think is it by Viktor Frankl? He talks about like our power is in that gap between stimulus and response. And that's really where our power is. There's another woman whose work I used to read. She had this book called Heal Your Life. I'm
Oh, is
forgetting
it
her name now. I think it's Louise Hay.
yes, it is Louise.
Yeah, so and this one point that she made in one of her books stuck with me. She's like, your point of power is always in the present moment. And so, the Enneagram can also be viewed as a doorway to presence because as you study your type, you'll notice that your type is either stuck in the past, it's ruminating, it's obsessing, it's, guilt-ridden, or it's stuck in the future, like what's going to happen? How am I going to stop that from happening? What if this happens? What if that happens? And both of those are basically thieves of our time,
And
and
thieves of
our
our
life.
joy. Yeah, thieves of our
Yes,
joy.
yeah, exactly. So, all of the patterns are based in this kind of taking us away from like what is in the present moment. And for me, the Enneagram was helpful in also just like self-acceptance, like rather than being like, you know, why can't I be like X person or Y person, or why does my life look so different? Am I not ambitious enough, or am I not this enough or that enough? just being able to rest in like, I was created in a unique way. And the way I was created has gifts, embedded within like my temperament. And I can lean into those gifts. And I can also notice the areas that, I might have blind spots or that, I may need to give more attention to, but I don't have to like kind of fight with myself in a way that feels um, berating or in a way that questions like my worth. Rather, it's, experiencing the beauty and the joy of having a certain temperament or personality at the same time, seeing how it can be limiting. And so I think that's ultimately the point of the Enneagram. So one of the Muslim authors who used to write on the Enneagram, Lale Bakhtiar, she described the journey as falling into the center. So not necessarily, one type becoming another type or, trying to change yourself into some other kind of person, but you're falling away from this like egoic pattern into the center. And, what she described is that's falling into this kind of deep relationship with the divine, oneness with Allah, kind of letting go of some of your ego attachments of like, I want to be like this or become like this, or I want my life to look like this, and this kind of surrender. And I felt like that really spoke to me and my kind of understanding of the spiritual journey in Islam.
Najiba, would you like to expand on how does the Enneagram help us understand our motivations rather than just our behaviors?
Yeah, that's a really important aspect. And so I think that's the shocking part, actually, of the Enneagram, because each of the points on the circle is showing um, an area that we may not be aware of that is driving the behavior. So, I can take an example of type 2, which is known as the giver. So it's the helpful, kind, giving soul. So according to the Enneagram, underneath that, there's a sense of pride. And the pride comes from this idea that um, I am here to help others. I am here to take away their problems or their burdens, to make them feel better. So I'm kind of indispensable and I am somebody who other people need. And I feel a sense of pride that I'm able to be that person in other people's lives. And also, I don't really need anything. Like, I'm okay. Um, and so that's like the hidden aspect of the two. And the other hidden aspect is the need to be needed. So this idea that part of what's driving the quote unquote giving is the need to find worth through this action of having helped someone or having done something for someone, to get that validation, to get that sense of worth or that sense of like, I'm important in someone else's life. And so you can think of that as something subtle, but even the Quran talks about this, right? It talks about like, when we give charity, please, when you give charity, don't follow it up with reminders of your generosity. And you might find, as a two, when one goes into the lower levels of two, there can be a kind of emotional blackmailing that might happen. Like, after everything I've done for you, like, how could you treat me like this? How could you forget me? How could you not give me importance in your life after everything I've given you, right? And so, like, you'll find in each of these points, there is a kind of hidden agenda that can be coming into play that we might be completely unaware of. And that's what makes the Enneagram kind of juicy when you apply it to yourself. I always tell people you should kind of feel like someone punched you in the gut when you read about like some of the lower levels that you can fall into and this like underlying kind of need that you have because it's not something that we're consciously aware of. And so it's very painful to look at.
Mhm. As you're speaking, I just keep thinking of Imam al-Ghazali's Marvels of the Heart, because that's exactly what he goes into, like all of the subtle motivations that one has underneath the behaviors. So I almost see that it would be valuable to almost look at that in tandem with this kind of work for spiritual advancement, right? Najiba, You have touched on this already. Are you willing to give more details about how this has impacted you personally in your personal life?
Sure. I think for me, there was definitely a waking up moment. So when I read about the nine as kind of like going with the flow and kind of going through life as if you're like on a raft on a river and you're just like, yeah, like the river will take me where I need to go. Like it's cool. Like everything's chill here. Literally, when I was reading this book, I was living in Hong Kong with my three little babies. I had like a 6 month old, a 1.5 year old, and like a 3 year old. And I was looking outside my window and I was thinking, like, how did I get here? I literally was like having this moment of like, how did I get to this point in my life? Like, have I chosen my life or like have I just let life choose things for me? So it just started this process of like seeing myself as an actor. So what I mean by actor is being an agent in my life, as opposed to one of the background issues of the type 9 is seeing yourself as like the wallpaper in the room. Like you're the one that provides the container for other people at the party to like interact. But you're not seeing yourself as part of the equation. So you're kind of removing yourself a little bit from what's happening. And therefore, nothing that happened was because of you. And you also can't be blamed for anything that happened because you were just the wallpaper, right? Like it's not like you were actually engaging in the discussions or the party. So it just started me on this process of like re-examining like, what were the decisions that I was making? How much of myself was I putting into the decisions that I was making in my life versus how much was I kind of hanging back? And this is where like the whole concept of spiritual bypassing started to become apparent to me. There's this concept that people talk about that, rather than looking at yourself or looking at the problems in your life, you can instead kind of rely on these like kind of spiritual epithets. So like for the nine, it could be sound something like, well, like Allah will take care of it. Like whatever is happening is for my highest good. Like, it's not about me choosing things. It's like, everything is written. Like, so we can take these concepts that come from our faith and our personality will just interpret them and use them as more fodder for whatever it is the personality wants to do, right? So if as a nine, I want to avoid making certain decisions or avoid pushing back on things, I can just like relax on my little raft and be like, yeah, like, Allah's taking care of things and it's not up to me to like rock the boat or change things. It's just like go with the flow and put other people's agendas first and make sure that, nobody is upset with you, nobody's mad at you. Just kind of keep being that agreeable person that, everyone will appreciate that, you didn't, um, yeah, you didn't challenge or you didn't rock that boat. So I just started to like look at that a little bit more and see how it applied to different areas in my life, whether it was like what kind of work I chose to do, applying it to my marriage, applying it to my parenting. So I just started to see that like I too was engaged in this game of life and I was using a strategy. It's not that other people were all using strategies and I was just like observing. The actual strategy was to maintain this inner sense of quote unquote peace and harmony, but it's at the expense of life itself. And so I started to notice the costs of that a little bit more. And I think that's what I often describe to people I work with is like the pain point. Like, if your life is going fine as it is, there's no need to change anything, right? Because you're happy, you're content. And so for a nine, that's a very tricky game to play because the nine is basically trying to calm themselves down at every moment and convince themselves that, in fact, everything is fine. There's no problems. And if there is a problem, then like somehow it'll get solved. No need to worry too much about it. And so, for me, it was kind of noticing how that strategy could actually be detrimental to my life. Um, and starting to like slowly kind of pull myself back from that just a little bit, just a tiny bit. Um, it definitely helped me understand the patterns in my marriage. So I was able to identify my type and my husband's type. And I remember having a good laugh about it after I was reading a cartoon book about the Enneagram, and it was just hilarious. It was like what each type does before the party, during the party, and after the party. And I just found it so funny. And so I think when I was able to inject some humor into it, it kind of took away that sense of judgment that I was carrying about myself and others. So even myself and my spouse. So rather than nitpicking and being like, oh, well, you're like this and I'm like this, being like, isn't this just so funny that we do this, that like, we show up like this and we have these worries and concerns. So that I think being able to laugh a little bit about it and not take myself so seriously, and not take, my husband's personality so seriously either, helped me kind of like calm down a little bit. So I'm a sexual nine, which means that I'm very focused on one-to-one relationships. That's like my subtype in the Enneagram. And so as sexuals tend to like really kind of attack their own relationships and be like, it's not perfect. It should be like this. It should feel like this. It should look a certain way. Um, and so I think, you know, looking at the types and then understanding that about myself, that I was being too hard on myself or too hard on some of my relationships, helped me just like take my foot off the gas a little bit and be like, okay, we can move away from this kind of like very insistent energy that wants something to happen and kind of relax a little bit. So it's kind of a both end. Like it's looking at yourself and doing some hard work, but then it's also relaxing a little bit and being like, hey, I'm not actually in control of all of that. Like it's okay. Like everyone's out there doing their own thing and they're living in their own universe, and I have no control over that. So let me just tune into my universe for a minute and see what I can do rather than, I think what gives myself and others, potentially a lot of anxiety is like trying to control things that we actually can't control, like other people, relationships, like things that are happening outside of ourselves. And so, yeah, for me, seeing like, oh, wow, all of us are actually operating with these very different understandings of what's actually happening in our lives and in the world kind of helped me detach from this idea that like, um, yeah, that I could convince someone to be different than they are. And for me, that was really helpful in a relationship to kind of let the other person be who they are and then let myself be who I am. So that was, I think, a kind of freedom that it helped me experience.
Would you say that it's led you to be more compassionate with your husband?
Yeah, I think a lot. So I think, despite being what is described as like an easygoing nine, I think I had a lot of judgment about other people showing up in ways that, I didn't like. So it could be my husband or other people. Like nines tend to be triggered by things like rudeness or like somebody overlooking them or not like, treating them a certain way. So I would interpret other people's actions in a certain way, and be like, oh, like how could a person talk to me like that? Or how could a person treat me like that? Like, what do they think I am? Or like, do they not love me or find me important? So I think I realized that there was a lot of judgment that I was carrying towards others. Um, and definitely in my own relationship with my husband, it helped me see like, yeah, like I was judging his personality. So he's a type 7, so very fun-loving, very spontaneous, very energetic. So I was, judging that personality and saying like, oh, well, this is like not being responsible, or this is not being sensitive, or this is not being this, like all these, I kind of had this image of like, this is what a good person does, and what this behavior I'm seeing is not like, compatible with like this image that I've created. But then the Enneagram kind of blew all that up for me, like there's no such thing as one good type of person or one bad type of person or one, you know, whatever type of behavior. Yes, we have values in Islam and we have things that we strive to, but that's going to look different in each individual person's life. So I think it definitely helped me, gave me a dose of humility, first of all, of just like, you are not perfect and you have no right to judge other people for, them being imperfect because like, you know, you're also creating problems in the world by some of the things that you do. You're also kind of not paying attention to certain things that like you should be. So it kind of gave me a dose of humility of like, you know, f focus on yourself for a moment, and look at yourself. But also that, who are you to say that this way of showing up in the world is any better or worse? So it just kind of helped me reframe things. So instead of framing something as like, oh, this is selfish, I could be like, oh, well, this is a person who is, living by their own priorities, or who's, for example, as a mom, if I'm, just allowing myself to only think about what the kids need, and like, my husband's going to the gym and taking care of his body, I could be like, oh, that's so selfish. Like, how could he do that? But then realizing for myself, like, you know what? I need to do that for myself. Why am I not doing that? Why am I not prioritizing my body the way that I see that he is? So in a way, I actually started to study him because in many ways we're kind of opposites in the characteristics that we have. I'm self-preservation repressed and he's self-preservation dominant. So that's where like the caring about the body stuff comes in. So I would like study him and be like, yeah, look what he's doing. Like, what if I tried doing that? Like, what would happen in my life if I stopped thinking that everyone else's priorities were so important and I just like did what I needed to do? Like, what would that feel like? So it kind of like gave me a little bit of room to play with like experimentation and kind of valuing the fact that, Allah partnered me with someone who's so different than me. So I could kind of like see another way of existing that was like totally different from my way of existing.
And there's growth in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Najiba, are there specific practices or exercises one can do who wants to work with the Enneagram?
Yeah, for sure. One of the teachers who I liked was David Daniels. He passed away a couple of years ago. And on his website, I think you can still sign up for this. You could sign up as your type, and then he would send you a reflection exercise like once a month. And so I used to love those because it was kind of like a little journaling practice. And it would be something like, you know, notice how, like, the energy of fear is showing up today. Like, what are these worries about? And like, um, what is the message that they're sending you or something like that. It would kind of be like a practice that was like touching on one of the kind of tender areas of your type. Um, so I think definitely creating a practice, and again, like, many of the Enneagram books have like kind of practice suggestions. So it could be something like, if you're a very heady based type, trying to go into an activity that activates like your heart center, for example. Like, for example, maybe as a type 5, you're like out of touch with your emotions, right? And that's the interesting thing about the Enneagram. It shows us that, like, hey, we all have emotions, but some of us are not in touch with our emotions. We've put them in a box and we're not really paying attention to them. So maybe as a type 5, to get in touch with my emotions, I might go watch a film or a play that would evoke these emotions in me so that I could like get in touch with them in kind of like a safe way, not like they're not my personal emotions, but maybe I can um, kind of vibe off the energy of someone else's emotion in a safe way. Um, or, if I'm a type 3 and I'm always focused on like, what do they think of me? Like, how good am I doing? How good am I looking? Like, am I hitting that target? Maybe I can find a space in my life where I can do something that's not at all about achieving something. It's like I'm going to, I don't know, like just mess around with some clay in my basement and not try to create a beautiful vase, but just like play with the clay, or like do something that kind of is taking me out of that set kind of lifestyle or about activities that my type is pushing me towards. So there's different things like that that are kind of easy first steps of like, let me try to engage in something that maybe is different from what my type is pushing me towards. There's some reflective exercises that you could do. Definitely also, I mean, the most available thing you could do is like literally just taking a few moments to sit with yourself and noticing like what's happening internally. Because most of us, our issue is like we're not paying that much attention to like what our internal experience is. We're externally sort of like doing stuff. And that's the culture that we live in, right? Is like do, do, do. It's not so much like be, be, be. So like I think the Enneagram is an invitation to kind of come inside a little bit and just like notice, what's happening in my mind, what's happening in my heart, what's happening in my gut center. And again, I think that can be tough to do on your own because like sometimes it's not like a pleasant experience to just sit there with your thoughts, right? That's why most of us stay busy. Um, so I think there can be, yeah, different ways that we can find to sort of find a little bit of a playground for us to, yeah, kind of play with our type energy a little bit. So there's a lot of things. It kind of depends on your type and what is it that you're choosing to work on. So I think just like starting with something really small, um, that kind of allows you to. So, just as an example, as a type 9, this idea of avoiding conflict, it could be like, oh, next time somebody asks me like, what do you want to do tonight? Instead of just being like, I don't know, like I'm cool with whatever, being like, let me just take a minute and think about what my priority is and let me voice that. Um, and maybe I need a little bit more time than the average person because I'm not in touch with my priorities. But maybe I t give myself that time and then I respond in a new way that like acknowledges like myself. So that's an example of like a small practice that somebody could start with.
Thank you. Thank you. So interesting. Is anything that you wanted to add in closing? Or do you think we've covered everything that you wanted to?
I would just say that, it's a journey and the Enneagram is a tool. So we're all on our own journeys, whether we use the Enneagram or not. Um, it's kind of, for me, what's beautiful about it is it's just like an acknowledgement of like the diversity of our human journeys. And I love that the Quran talks about, the diversity of human beings and how that's very intentional, that Allah made us into different nations and tribes and made us different colors and different genders. And that's actually part of our play here in this universe, like that we're all part of. And so for me, there was an experience of just like coming home and relaxing into like this human family. Like, hey, we're all different, but we all have a purpose. Like we all have a reason why we're here, and we also each have a very unique social function. That's something that I loved learning about in one of my classes. Like, what is the very unique and important function that each type is bringing into their community? And for me, that was like really just like kind of blew me away. And, again, was like very humbling to see like, yeah, we actually need all of this. Like, we need the energy of the one and we need the energy of the seven and the four and the two. Like no one is better than another. It's like we're all playing in the symphony and like you want all the instruments there because otherwise like, who wants to just hear like the tuba or the triangle or whatever. You want to hear everything. So I think, whatever we can do as human beings to first understand ourselves, but then extend that understanding to others and build compassion in ourselves, that's going to be a road for us to, I think, inshallah, heal ourselves and heal our relationships. And, my hope is that is really the energy that can heal many of the difficulties and conflicts we have in the world today.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. Uh, difficulties and conflicts we have in the world today.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.